A father left his newborn daughter with hydrocephalus deep in the heart of the woods, surrendering her fate to the mercy of the gods. Yet, what began as an act of cruelty became the start of a journey, one that would forever alter the course of the little girl's life. In a remote village in the south of the Republic of Madagascar, the night was thick with silence, broken only by the rustling of wind through the tall palms and the occasional cry of nocturnal creatures. Paulo clutched his infant daughter close, her small, fragile form swaddled in a blanket, head heavy against his shoulder. Her breathing was shallow, her tiny hands limp. He cast a wary glance over his shoulder as he walked further into the dense forest, every step heavy with uncertainty, each pause filled with a dread that had begun gnawing at him weeks ago. Since her mother Shani's death during childbirth, Paulo had devoted himself to his daughter's care, though grief haunted his every waking moment. For 3 months he watched over her, shushing her cries at night, whispering lullabies he'd learned as a child. But then, something changed. Her head, once perfectly round, began to swell, and her skin pulled taut around the bulging veins beneath. Her eyes, once bright, grew listless, and her tiny body seemed to weaken with every passing day. He brought her to the village healer, his heart pounding with hope. "Please," he murmured, laying her down on the small, weathered mat in the healer's hut. "Is there something you can do?" The healer glanced at the child, then at Paulo with a somber shake of his head. "This is not a child's illness, Paulo. It is something else." Something else. The words hung in the air, heavy, filling the space between them with an unspoken fear. As days passed and his daughter's condition worsened, Paulo became desperate. He was a man who had buried his wife, and now found himself at the mercy of forces he couldn't understand, facing the prospect of losing his daughter as well. His heart screamed at him to keep her close, to protect her, yet the whispers of the village elders rang louder in his ears each day. "This is the work of spirits," they told him in hushed voices. "Paulo, take heed. She's touched by something beyond us. You must let the forest gods decide her fate." The elders' words, woven with age-old beliefs and fear, clung to Paulo's mind, swirling around like shadows. He found himself awake each night, watching his daughter struggle to breathe, her small chest rising and falling in uneven gasps. The fear twisted deeper with every breath she took. He thought of Shani's face, her eyes full of hope as she'd awaited their daughter's birth. She wouldn't want this suffering for her child, he told himself. And so, as dawn broke one morning, Paulo steeled himself. He gathered his daughter, wrapped her tenderly in a blanket, and whispered an apology she would never hear. "Forgive me, my love," he murmured, his voice a choked whisper against her brow. "If this is the will of the gods, I cannot defy it." The village elders had instructed him carefully. 3 days, they'd said, nodding gravely. "Let's leave her in the forest, near the village's sacred mountain. If she is to live, she will. The spirits will see to it." Paulo stopped when he reached a small clearing, his breath hitching. This was the spot where the elders had told him to leave her. The wind stirred the trees, and the sky overhead was a dull slate grey. He knelt, his hands trembling as he placed his daughter on a soft bed of moss, her head resting unevenly, the once familiar weight now a twisted symbol of the unknown. Paulo felt the pull of every instinct within him to stay, to fight for her, yet the words of the elders silenced that inner voice, numbing his senses with an eerie calm. He took one last look at his daughter, her face small and pale against the green forest floor. Her eyes fluttered slightly, as if sensing his presence. "I'll return," he promised, though he wasn't sure if he'd return to find her alive or reclaimed by the forest's shadowy gods. The trees seemed to close in as he backed away, the sound of his steps muffled by the damp earth. With each step, his resolve grew weaker, but he dared not look back. As he left, the forest grew quiet again, holding the child in a stillness only the ancient woods could know. The forest exhaled its early morning stillness, quiet but for the occasional rustle of leaves and the distant calls of tropical birds. Victoria Graham, breathing in the cool dawn air, adjusted her backpack and looked over at her husband, Phillips Graham, who was engrossed in a conversation with their local guide, a tall man named Juma. The Grahams are famous pediatricians in the US, and they are on a volunteer trip to Madagascar. They had spent the past week working non-stop, providing medical care to children in this village. Now, after 7 grueling days, the couple were finally on a brief respite, venturing deeper into the wilderness on a camping trip with the volunteer team. "You know, it's almost surreal out here," Victoria murmured as they trekked forward, her eyes scanning the lush foliage. "Last night I kept waking up expecting a beeping monitor or a line of mothers waiting for medicine." Phillips chuckled. "Can't blame you. I keep expecting Juma to hand me a list of patients," he replied, shaking his head. "But this break is overdue, even if it's just for one morning." Juma, overhearing, nodded in agreement. "You two have worked tirelessly. This forest is a place of renewal, a good change from all that chaos." The trio walked in comfortable silence, the forest floor damp underfoot, leaves crunching softly with each step. The volunteers, a mix of locals and a few foreign doctors, followed close behind, talking in low voices about the work they'd done that week. Some joked, others just walked quietly, basking in the silence that only a forest could offer. Suddenly, a soft whimpering noise broke through the ambient sounds of the forest. Victoria froze, raising her hand for the others to stop. "Did anyone else hear that?" she whispered, brow furrowing. Everyone fell silent, listening intently. There it was again, a faint cry, weak and almost swallowed by the forest itself. Phillips moved closer, following the sound. The cry grew louder as they approached a thicket of trees. There, on the ground, nestled among fallen leaves and tangled roots, lay a small bundle wrapped in a threadbare cloth. Inside was a baby girl, her skin pale and gaunt, eyes barely open. Victoria crouched down, her heart catching in her throat. "Phillips, look at her head," she whispered. The child's head was enlarged, far too large for her tiny body, and beads of sweat dotted her brow despite the coolness of the forest floor. "My God," Phillips breathed, kneeling beside his wife. "She's severely malnourished, and it looks like hydrocephalus." He shook his head, scanning the child with practiced eyes. "We need to get her to a hospital, now." Victoria lifted the fragile child carefully, feeling how feather-light she was. The baby barely moved, her cries reduced to soft, shallow gasps. Juma looked on with a mixture of sadness and resignation, muttering something under his breath. "Is there a hospital nearby that could handle this?" Phillips asked, his voice tight with urgency. He knew the answer before Juma even spoke, but he needed to hear it. "No, Dr. Graham," Juma replied, shaking his head. "The nearest hospital has no equipment for this level of care. You would need a city clinic, but even then..." Victoria and Phillips exchanged a glance. They were well aware of the grim medical infrastructure here. She cradled the baby against her chest, feeling the faintest heartbeat. "We'll have to make do," she murmured. The journey back to the village was swift, with Phillips already on his satellite phone, contacting their American colleagues for assistance. Victoria tended to the baby as best as she could, cleaning her, wrapping her in the cleanest cloth they had, and checking her vitals every few minutes. By the time they reached the village, Phillips had arranged a call with a team back in the United States. Within hours, a temporary medical team arrived from the nearest major clinic, including American doctors who could set up a makeshift system to relieve some of the fluid pressure from the child's brain. Victoria and Phillips watched intently as the doctors worked, exchanging tense glances as each step unfolded. It was a delicate, temporary solution, merely a way to buy time. But the child's condition continued to deteriorate, her breaths growing shallower as the hours passed. "We can't wait any longer," Phillips said finally, his jaw tight with resolve. "We need to get her out of here and to a hospital with the right resources." Victoria nodded, determination set in her eyes. "We'll do whatever it takes," she whispered, holding the child close. She didn't yet know the child's name, her origin, or her story, but Victoria could feel the fragile pulse of life beneath her fingers. It was all the motivation she needed. That night, they made arrangements to take the child back to the United States, and as the plane lifted off the next morning, Victoria kept vigil over the small, sleeping girl, vowing that no matter what, they would give her the fighting chance she deserved. The forest was still, veiled in the thick pre-dawn mist. Paolo halted near a large rock, his eyes scanning the place he knew by heart, where the forest floor had been blanketed in her tiny blanket. Only now there was no sign of her, not a thread or even an imprint left in the soil. His heart sank as the realization set in. His daughter was truly gone. Sadness clung to him, a deep, relentless sorrow that weighed his shoulders down. But it was more than that. In the days after he'd left her, a quiet acceptance had also taken root within him. His wife, taken by childbirth, and now his daughter, swept away by forces beyond his control. It was the will of the gods, he told himself. These were not his decisions to make. They were simply his burdens to bear. With every step back toward the village, Paolo reminded himself, "My daughter's spirit is safe, guarded by those who dwell in a world we cannot see. She is at peace." Paolo kept his gaze on the ground as he returned, eyes dry but soul heavy, carrying an ache that would likely stay for as long as he did. The villagers watched him from a distance, sharing his grief, but keeping their silence out of respect. They, too, believed his daughter's fate was now sealed in the hands of spirits who would know what to do with her soul. Thousands of miles away, in the bustling city of New York, Victoria Graham leaned over the crib, watching as the small, fragile girl stirred. Her head was still disproportionately large, the recent surgery leaving a subtle scar that traced a line near her temple, but her breathing had steadied. There was a calmness about her now, a resilience that made Victoria's heart swell with a strange mixture of hope and protectiveness. Phillips joined her at the side of the crib, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. "She seems stronger every day, doesn't she?" Victoria nodded, a faint smile pulling at her lips. "It's incredible, really. Everything she's been through." She trailed off, her gaze fixed on the girl's peaceful face. She was hesitant to name the emotions stirring inside her, though they'd been growing steadily since they'd first brought her from that hospital in Madagascar. "I can't help but feel she was meant to survive." Phillips squeezed her shoulder gently. "Sometimes it feels like we were meant to find her too," he said, his voice low. The girl stirred, her eyes fluttering open for just a moment, the look of confusion and innocence in her gaze twisting Victoria's heart further. She glanced at Phillips, the unspoken decision between them growing stronger with each passing day. A week later, Victoria returned alone to the hospital for a routine checkup on the girl's recovery. As she stepped into the ward, she found herself moving instinctively toward the crib where Gabriella lay. The medical team had taken to calling her Gabriel after Phillips had remarked on her tenacity, her refusal to succumb to the hardships thrown at her so early. Victoria reached into the crib, gently stroking Gabriel's tiny hand with her finger. The girl's fingers curled around hers, and she felt an odd sense of grounding, like Gabrielle was somehow holding her in place too. "We're here, Gabriel," she murmured, trying the name aloud. It felt right, familiar, as though it had always belonged to her. The nurse on duty, a kind woman named Marie, approached with a clipboard in hand. "She's responding remarkably well, Mrs. Graham. Given her condition, it's a small miracle she's recovered this quickly." Victoria's eyes stayed on Gabriel. "She deserves more than just a chance to survive, Marie. She deserves a family." Marie paused, then lowered her voice as she responded. "You know, there's something special about that girl. The way she holds on. I can't help but think she was meant for something more, too." That night, Victoria and Phillips spoke in hushed tones across their dinner table, their faces lit by the soft glow of a candle. They'd discussed this decision before, but always stopped just short of commitment. Now, though, it felt like a truth that needed no more words. "Are we ready for this?" Victoria asked, breaking the quiet. "It's a lifetime, you know, more than just taking care of her now. She'd be ours." Phillips reached across the table, his expression resolute. "If you're ready, then so am I. We may not know exactly what the future holds for her, but she deserves a family who'll give her everything." Victoria's eyes misted over as she nodded, a deep relief and quiet joy blossoming inside her. They would give her a name, Gabriella Graham, and call her Gabriel, a name that spoke of strength and resilience, fitting for this little girl who had already survived so much. 2 weeks later, the Grahams brought Gabriel home. Her crib was set up beside a large window overlooking a quiet garden, and Victoria spent hours there, watching Gabriel sleep and occasionally rocking her, feeling the weight of responsibility settle into a kind of peace. Each day, as Gabriel's strength returned, her connection with Victoria and Phillips grew, filling the space where uncertainty had once been. From that moment forward, Gabriel's life shifted. No longer abandoned, no longer a child of uncertainty, she began to blossom in her new world. And as the seasons changed, as the days turned into months, the Grahams began to see the true miracle of what they'd found. Not just a child, but a family, woven together by the simple, unbreakable thread of love. Victoria Graham's fingers gently traced the edge of the small crib, her gaze softening as she watched Gabriel's chest rise and fall, each breath slow and slightly labored. It had been a year now, one filled with late nights, hospital stays, and moments that stretched thin as the delicate skin on Gabriel's hands. Yet in each of these moments, Victoria and her husband Phillips felt their resolve only hardened. They had committed to this small life, to seeing her through every challenge, even those that lingered, unseen yet heavy, in the space around her. Her development was a rhythm slightly out of sync with other children her age. Daniel and Cheryl, their older children, noticed it too, sometimes pausing mid-play to watch as Gabriel worked to lift her head or reach a toy, the effort in her eyes evident. But neither sibling ever let the differences linger. Instead, they celebrated each small victory, every wobbling step or clumsy reach. "She's going to surprise us all one day," Daniel whispered one evening, holding his little sister's hand as if entrusting her with some unspoken promise. Victoria remembered that moment well. It was as if the entire family had made an unspoken vow to root Gabriel in their love, in hope. And the world outside their home began to notice too. The day of Gabriel's baptism brought an unexpected flurry of attention. News of the adoption of a girl born in Madagascar with a condition many had dismissed as hopeless had somehow slipped into the local press. That Sunday morning, as Victoria and Phillips carried Gabriel into the small church, they were greeted by flashing cameras and murmuring reporters. The story seemed to capture people, a testament to resilience, to second chances, they'd say. The church was abuzz, murmurs and whispers bouncing softly off the vaulted ceilings as the congregation gathered. The priest's voice filled the chapel, solemn and resonant, invoking blessings and grace. He placed a gentle hand on Gabriel's forehead, his murmurs a gentle hum in the stillness. Her big eyes looked up at him, unblinking, too young to understand, but alert to every sound and touch. When he finally poured the water over her head, her mouth opened in a surprised little "oh," but no cry came, only a soft exhale. Those gathered let out a collective breath, as if the child's silence was a signal of something greater, something enduring. Victoria had stood beside Phillips as they held Gabriel up for the baptismal blessing, her heart swelling with pride mixed with a hint of worry. They hadn't intended to share Gabriel's story so publicly, but as she looked out at the crowd, she saw faces softened with empathy, strangers moved by this small life, as if recognizing the fight within her. That spirit, so evident to them all, grew stronger with each passing day. Gabriel's health challenges remained, her small frame fragile, her energy often waning quickly. But there was something in her eyes, a gleam of quiet resolve. Victoria caught it most when music played in the house, or when Cheryl danced around her sister, sweeping her arms in little twirls. Gabriel would sit wide-eyed, her hands lifting and lowering to the rhythm, an instinctive mimicry that made her family exchange surprised glances. As she grew, they began to see the whispers of something else, an affinity for movement, an urge to rise and sway. Phillips, noticing her gaze fixed on the spinning records, suggested they try a tiny ballet class, one tailored for children like Gabriel, who needed slower paces, gentler teachers. And there, in that soft-spoken space, Gabriel found herself. Victoria and Phillips never missed a class, staying close as Gabriel took hesitant steps. Her posture was uncertain, her frame delicate, yet her expression grew focused, almost determined. Each movement, however small, seemed to awaken something within her, a rhythm, a grace, a strength that could not be explained, only felt. One afternoon, Phillips leaned close to Victoria, his voice a low murmur. "It's as if she's found her way to speak through this." Victoria, her heart full, nodded. Yes, it's her language. Their encouragement grew alongside her passion. Each step, a celebration. Each misstep, a moment of patience. Slowly, they watched her blossom, her body bending and spinning in ways they had never imagined possible. Though her journey remained fraught with limitations, they knew now, as she did, that her spirit was boundless, unfolding in ways that would shape them all. When Gabriel turned 6, the Grahams decided it was time to return to Madagascar. It was a trip with purpose, not just for their ongoing volunteer work, but also for Gabriel. Victoria and Phillips hoped the journey would give her a sense of the roots she carried within her, to know the culture and country that once held her tiny, fragile form. They arrived in Madagascar at the end of the rainy season. The city streets buzzed with color and life, a symphony of bustling markets, the call of vendors, and the scent of roasted spices filling the air. For Victoria and Phillips, it was both familiar and humbling. For Gabriel, it was a place both strange and wonderfully alive, each corner filled with something new to take in. Yet there was an odd ease about her, as if she was stepping into something that was already part of her. One evening, the Grahams held a community event in a small village just beyond the main city, a place where Phillips and Victoria had once worked during their early days as volunteers. As part of the event, Gabrielle was set to perform a ballet piece for the local children. She had been practicing for weeks, twirling and leaping in the family living room, determined to bring her best to the crowd. Under the evening sky, villagers gathered on wooden benches, filling the small outdoor space. Children squeezed between adults, eyes wide with anticipation. Gabrielle took the small stage, her feet tiny against the weathered boards. She glanced at her parents, who gave her an encouraging nod. With a deep breath, she began. Gabrielle moved across the stage, each step light and precise, her face focused and expressive. Her dance told a story that went beyond her years, a blend of grace and quiet strength, as though she was dancing for someone unseen. The audience, usually filled with chatter, fell into a hushed silence. She held their gaze, moving in fluid arcs, lost in her own world. Among the onlookers stood a man, eyes narrowed as he watched her with an intensity that went unnoticed by others. He was modestly dressed, his face worn by years of labor and weather, his frame slightly hunched. But as he watched Gabrielle, his breath caught. Something in her movements, in the way her eyes sparkled under the soft lights, stirred a deep memory. He could feel a connection, faint yet unmistakable. As the performance concluded, the crowd erupted into applause. Gabrielle took a shy bow, a small smile gracing her face as she glanced into the crowd. Paolo's gaze lingered on her, the odd sense of connection tightening into something almost painful. Lost in thought, he turned to leave, but his attention caught on a tattered magazine resting on a nearby table. The faded cover featured a smiling couple, their arms wrapped around a young girl with a large, luminous gaze. Above them, bold letters headlined, "American Family Rescues Abandoned Child with Hydrocephalus from the Forest." The blood drained from Paolo's face. With trembling hands, he picked up the magazine, scanning the article that recounted the Graham family's discovery of an abandoned girl with an abnormally large head, thought to be cursed, left alone in the forest. His chest tightened as he read on, each word pressing heavier than the last. Hydrocephalus. It was not a curse. It was an illness, something medical, something that could have been treated if only he had understood. A sickness, not the work of evil spirits as he'd feared. "Oh, Gabrielle," he whispered, his voice breaking. An old wound he'd thought had scarred over, ripped open, spilling out the regrets he'd long tried to bury. He could still see her tiny face as he'd laid her on that mossy ground, his heart clinging to the old beliefs, the only reality he'd known. But now he saw his own cowardice and the weight of his ignorance. In that moment, Paolo's world tilted. He had believed he was doing the only thing he could. Yet here she was, alive, thriving, a testament to the strength he had not possessed. He stumbled out of the crowd, hands shaking, nearly dropping the magazine. This was her, his daughter, the girl he had left behind in the forest all those years ago. He pressed his hands to his face, as if trying to hold back the realization clawing its way through his mind. This child, dancing before him with such grace and confidence, was the very same baby he had given up in desperation and fear. Memories of that fateful night flooded back. The decision he made, the prayers he whispered as he walked away. He waited for the event to end, all the while haunted by the gap between him and the daughter he had never known. Summoning every ounce of courage, he approached Victoria and Phillips after the performance. His voice was low, almost a whisper, as he introduced himself. Victoria's expression changed, tightening with suspicion. She asked him questions, her voice steady but cautious, her eyes searching his face for answers. The Grahams stood across from a man they had hoped to never meet. He had the roughness of years etched into his face, a face worn and broken, yet eyes steady and desperate. "So you've come all this way," Philip said, his voice low and steady as he studied the man standing before him. He tightened his grip on Victoria's hand, sensing her inner conflict. "To claim a daughter you left to die." The man, Paolo, nodded, his hands trembling slightly. "I know what it sounds like," he admitted, voice cracked and raw. "But in my heart, I believed it was a choice, a ritual that would save her soul. I was wrong. I see that now." He took a breath, shoulders weighed down by a burden of regret that looked as if it would break him. "She's my blood, and I don't ask for forgiveness. I just want the chance to know her." Phillips's jaw clenched, his tone sharp. "You don't get to claim her now. Gabriel is safe. She's happy and she's ours. The moment you left her there, in that forest, you forfeited any claim." Paolo's face crumbled as he held back tears, but his gaze didn't waver. He stood his ground, trying to find the right words, but they escaped him, leaving only silence and the weight of past mistakes hanging in the air. Victoria looked down, feeling a pang of empathy she tried hard to resist. She could sense the sincerity in Paolo's eyes, an unmistakable sorrow that softened her heart, despite everything she knew he had done. "Phillips," she began softly, but Phillips's grip tightened on her hand, his resolve unyielding. "No, Victoria." His voice was firm, his eyes cold as he met hers. "Gabriel doesn't need to know anything about this man's choices. He's a stranger to her. We won't disrupt her life for his convenience." Gabriel, unknowingly caught in the weight of adult secrets, had wandered close enough to hear bits of the exchange. She peered around the corner, curiosity in her eyes as she caught glimpses of a conversation laced with tension. She was too young to make sense of it, too innocent to recognize the battle lines being drawn over her future. The murmuring voices and hardened expressions left Gabriel puzzled, but she lingered, the feeling of something important brewing, something deep and unsettling in the words she didn't fully understand. Her heart, however, sensed the gravity of the moment, and she instinctively drew back, pressing herself against the wall, hoping to remain unseen. Paolo took a step forward, but Phillips's hand shot out, blocking his path. "You lost your right to call yourself her father," Phillips said, voice steeled with anger. "She's my daughter now, and I'll do whatever it takes to protect her from you, from the consequences of your ritual." Paolo's face fell, and he lowered his gaze, nodding slowly, as if coming to terms with a punishment he had long known he deserved. Victoria looked at the man, her heart a battlefield of empathy and loyalty. She could see the pain in Paolo's face, the regret that could never be erased. "Phillips," she said gently, "perhaps Gabriel should know someday, when she's old enough to understand." Phillips's response was instant, his voice cutting. "No, we're leaving this in the past for good." He looked Paolo squarely in the eyes. "We're going back to the States, and as far as Gabriel is concerned, you don't exist." Victoria glanced at Paolo, who stood in silence, bearing the weight of his past decisions, of the life he could have been a part of, but was now forever denied. His lips pressed together, and he nodded slightly, words of protest unsaid, resigned to the consequences of his actions. As they turned to walk away, Victoria felt the ghost of guilt gnawing at her, but she clung to Philip's arm. Gabriel, hidden from sight, watched as her parents moved away from the stranger, their conversation lost to the whisper of the trees. She sensed something was being left behind, something important and tangled with her own life, but she couldn't grasp it. The three of them returned to the safe cocoon of the life they had built, leaving the encounter behind like an unfinished chapter in an old, unread story. The air in the Graham household was warm with laughter and the subtle aroma of the cake cooling in the kitchen. It was Gabriel's 15th birthday, and she knew it was going to be a special day. It was rare to have such a celebration for her, but Victoria insisted they go all out this year. Friends from ballet were arriving, and the living room was bright with sunlight and decorated with simple, elegant flowers. Gabriel twirled in her room, her new lavender dress swishing around her legs, her reflection in the mirror catching her gaze. She paused and glanced down at her feet, perfectly positioned. It was second nature now, the ballet, and in this moment she felt a deep joy in her chest, an overwhelming sense of gratitude. The last few years had been intense with endless rehearsals, performances and lessons, but here she was, surrounded by people who loved her. "Gabriel, sweetheart, come downstairs, everyone's waiting." Victoria's voice echoed from the hallway. Gabriel grinned, adjusting her dress one last time before bounding down the stairs. The sight below filled her heart with a mix of joy and disbelief. There were her friends, her family, all gathered around the big table, with a cake that seemed almost too beautiful to eat. Gabrielle blew out the candles to the cheers and applause of the crowd. Later that evening, the guests were gone. The lights dimmed. She stood alone in the soft glow of the living room, her eyes drifting over the framed photos on the walls. Moments captured throughout her childhood, each one carefully curated by Victoria. Her mother had always been diligent about details, preserving the memories they built together as if they were heirlooms. And yet, there was a quiet ache in Gabriel's heart that couldn't be silenced by the happy faces in those photographs. Victoria entered the room, her silhouette soft against the hallway light, carrying a small box. "I wanted to give you this when everything had quieted down," she said, offering a gentle smile. "Happy birthday, Gabriel." Gabriel took the box, her hands brushing against its smooth wooden surface. She glanced at her mother, 1,000 words forming on her tongue, but refusing to coalesce into anything she could say. She opened the box slowly, revealing a delicate silver bracelet with a single charm, a small ballet shoe sparkling under the dim light. "Mom, it's beautiful," she murmured, fastening it around her wrist, but even as the charm glinted, her mind drifted back to a day they'd long since left behind, back in Madagascar. She hadn't intended to think of it now, but the memory felt persistent, threading its way through the years and tugging at her thoughts. She looked up at her mother, her voice trembling. "Mum, can I ask you something?" Victoria, sensing something deeper in her tone, sat beside her, giving a warm, encouraging nod. "Anything, sweetheart." Gabriel swallowed, choosing her words carefully. "That time, in Madagascar, I overheard something. You and Dad were talking to a man. He was angry. I didn't understand everything, but it sounded important. About me." She held her mother's gaze, her eyes searching for answers. A flicker of surprise crossed Victoria's face, softening into something deeper. She took a long breath, letting it out slowly as she seemed to gather herself. "Gabriel," she began, her voice hushed yet steady. "There's something we haven't told you. Not because we didn't want to, but because we thought you should be older, that you deserved time to grow without the weight of it." Gabriel felt her heart race, her palms growing cold. She hadn't expected her mother to confirm anything. She half expected an explanation that would brush off her worries. But this was different. "What do you mean?" she whispered, barely trusting her voice. Victoria reached for her hand, holding it with a firm, comforting grip. You see, you came to us differently than other children come to their parents. We found you, Gabriel. Or rather, you found us. You were only a baby, left in the most impossible circumstances. When we saw you there, I knew, both your father and I knew, that we couldn't leave you, that you were ours. The weight of her mother's words pressed down on Gabriel, settling heavily on her chest. She'd known, somehow, known that there was a piece missing. But the truth she'd just heard was more profound than she'd ever imagined. So, my real parents went. They didn't want me. Victoria's eyes glistened, but her voice remained calm. Gabriel, I don't know the full story. We only knew that you were alone, and that's all that mattered. We loved you from the moment we saw you, and that has never changed. But if you want to know more, if you feel ready, we can try to find out together. Gabriel stared down at the bracelet, tracing the small ballet shoe charm with her thumb. A soft breath escaped her lips, and she realized she wasn't sure what she felt. There was sadness, yes, but also an odd sense of peace, knowing that Victoria had told her the truth. Her family might not have been conventional, but they were hers. Thank you for telling me, Mum, she whispered, looking up with a tentative smile. I think I'd like to know more. Maybe not today, but someday. Victoria pulled her into an embrace, her voice soft. Whenever you're ready, Gabriel, I'll be right here. And in that moment, Gabriel understood that family wasn't only about origins. It was about the choices they'd made together. And maybe, she thought, as her mother held her close, maybe that was enough. In the quiet, humid air of the Madagascar countryside, Gabriel clutched her bag and cast a glance at Victoria, who offered a reassuring nod. Before them lay a small hut, weathered and leaning, half concealed by dense, wild foliage. Gabriel took a breath, steadying herself as she absorbed the scene. Inside that hut, after so many years, was her father. Do you want me to come with you? Victoria's voice was calm, measured. Gabriel shook her head. No, I need to do this alone. She gripped the woven straps of her bag tighter. Thank you, though. Victoria nodded and retreated, leaving Gabriel to approach the door alone. She paused, feeling the weight of the years pressing down on her, the knowledge that the man inside had once left her in a forest. But she was here now, ready to understand rather than resent, to seek answers rather than confront. She tapped on the door, a tentative hollow sound against the fragile wood. It creaked open a crack, and a face appeared, worn and lined with age, eyes sunken but still alert. Paolo stared at her, and for a fleeting second, Gabriel thought he might turn her away, but he stepped aside, nodding slightly as he gestured her in. Inside, the air was heavy, carrying scents of earth and a faint whiff of smoke. An old wooden table sat in the center, its surface cluttered with small figurines and dried herbs. Paolo moved with a slow, deliberate care, taking his place on a rickety stool. Why have you come back? His voice was hoarse, as though it had been a long time since he'd spoken to anyone. Gabriel looked around the sparse interior, a home stripped of any comfort, and met his gaze. I needed to understand why. Why did you left me? Paolo's gaze dropped, the lines of his face deepening as he exhaled. The villagers, they told me to leave you. Said it was the only way to save you, that the gods would decide your fate. He raised his hands, calloused and trembling. I was terrified. Your mother was gone. I was alone. I thought maybe they were right. Maybe leaving you was the only way to protect you. A bitter edge crept into Gabriel's voice despite herself. "You left me to die." Paolo's head dipped lower, his voice barely a whisper. "I thought, if you lived, the gods would have saved you. But when I came back, you were gone, and I thought, they have taken you." He looked up, his eyes brimmed with tears. "But I was wrong. It was people who found you, not gods." Gabriel's fingers twitched, struggling to bridge the gap between anger and compassion. The man before her was fragile, defeated. And yet she couldn't ignore the life she had, the family who had given her love and opportunity beyond anything he could have imagined. "So you believed it was the God's will that Victoria and Phillips found me?" Paolo nodded slowly, a faint glimmer of relief softening his worn features. "I have nothing but this belief that the gods sent them. They saved you when I couldn't. I've thought of that every day. The guilt." His voice broke, and he hung his head, as if bowing under the weight of all those years. Gabriel took a step closer, feeling the bitterness inside her dissolve into a strange, quiet understanding. She had come here seeking answers, but now she felt as though she was giving something far greater. She crouched beside him, resting a hand on his shoulder. "I'm not angry," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I can't say I understand, but I don't hate you, and I'm glad to know you never forgot." Paolo's head lifted, his face etched with disbelief. You forgive me?" Gabriel nodded, feeling an odd, unexpected release. "Yes, I forgive you." The silence that followed was thick yet soft, like a balm settling over a long open wound. Paolo's shoulders shook, his tears falling silently. Gabriel remained by his side, sensing the weight of the years lift, piece by piece. Victoria's figure reappeared at the doorway, her eyes meeting Gabriel's with a silent question. Gabriel gave her a small nod, a wordless assurance that something important had been mended, a fragment of her heart now whole. After a time, Paolo spoke again, his voice a fragile whisper. "Thank you. You've given an old man peace." Gabriel squeezed his hand, feeling a quiet strength built within her. The journey had been long, painful, and full of questions. But now she knew that, like all things, it had brought her back to herself and to the path she was meant to walk. Paolo lay still, his breath shallow, face relaxed as if already somewhere else, somewhere far from the dark room and its quiet, pressing air. His eyes fluttered open, finding hers, and a faint smile, a remnant of what could have been, settled across his face. He reached out, weak and tentative, and Gabriel, with a small but determined smile, took his hand. He exhaled softly, his grip loosening as if relieved. His eyes closed, and, as Gabriel watched, the tension faded from his features, his last breath leaving him in a gentle, surrendering sigh. He's gone. Next day, on the flight back to the US. Gabriel sat by the window, watching the continent fade beneath the clouds. Her heart felt impossibly heavy, laden with a mix of relief, sorrow, and a tenderness she hadn't anticipated. Madagascar had been a place of birth and betrayal, of mystery and hurt, but also, strangely, a part of her story she felt more connected to now. She brushed a hand over her stomach, feeling the pulse of the past, yet knowing the strength that had brought her back to the skies. Her mother, Victoria, who sat beside her, touched her shoulder lightly. "You all right, Gabriel?" Victoria's voice, gentle as ever, held that maternal warmth that had carried Gabriel through every moment she couldn't quite carry herself. Gabriel nodded, her gaze still locked on the vanishing land below. I'm okay," she replied, though her voice wavered. "It's strange. I didn't know him, not really. But somehow being there felt right, like maybe some part of me belonged to that place, too. Victoria looked at her daughter, seeing the maturity that had only grown with each performance, each hurdle, each return to Madagascar's red earth. "You're from both places, Gabriel," she whispered, her hand gently brushing a lock of Gabriel's hair. "And you're carrying the best of both with you." Gabriel didn't speak for a moment, letting the words settle over her, grounding her in this vastness between worlds. She knew her path was set. Ballet, the lights, the discipline, all of it had defined her in a way that Madagascar never could have. But the experience had touched her differently, leaving a kind of softness she hadn't expected, a knowledge that forgiveness could be offered even to those who had never asked. Years passed, and Gabriel's fame in ballet only grew. The world saw her talent, the grace in her steps, the strength she held despite her past. But in every performance, Gabriel carried with her a piece of Madagascar. The blood that tied her to that distant land, the resolve of a man who'd been unable to keep her, and the family who'd chosen her nonetheless. And when she danced, there was a quiet, untold story woven into every movement, a story of love not easily understood and pain softened by forgiveness. In those moments, she felt herself whole, a bridge between worlds and histories. Gabriel's life had become a testament, a legacy of struggle and healing, an embodiment of the power of love and redemption, living proof that even in the deepest wounds, something beautiful could emerge. Thank you for staying with us through this heartfelt story. Gabriel's journey has shown us the incredible power of love, forgiveness, and the ability to heal even the deepest wounds. From a little girl left behind, Gabriel rose through the love of her family, transforming every hardship into the strength to become a shining ballet star. This story reminds us that forgiveness can often free both the one who gives it and the one who receives it. Gabriel not only found herself, but also proved that, even in the hardest circumstances, there's always a path to rise and find light. If you were moved by this story, don't forget to hit like and subscribe so you won't miss more inspiring stories. Leave a comment to share your thoughts, and let's spread the message of love and compassion together. See you in the next video.